Azure Resource Manager is the equivalent to Deployment Manager. Both are used to manage infrastructure as code. You can build reusable Azure Resource Manager templates using JSON syntax. With Deployment Manager, you can build top-level deployment configuration in YAML and reusable templates in Jinja or Python. Azure Resource Manager and Cloud Deployment Manager both enable you to define outputs for a template. For example, you can expose the IP address of a database created in a template so that users can easily reference the IP address when creating their own templates. Both Deployment Manager and Azure Resource Manager enable you to manage infrastructure with conditions to create or omit certain resources. In Deployment Manager, you can set a property in the deployment configuration file. You can pass this property to a template that launches a different VM based on the value of that property. In Azure Resource Manager, you can achieve the same functionality by defining a template with conditions to create or omit certain resources. For example, consider an Azure Deployment Manager template that creates resources for a web application environment. You can add conditions to allow or restrict internal IP addresses. Let's see how the two deployment technologies compare. An instance of configuration created using Deployment Manager is called a deployment. An instance of configuration created using Azure Resource Manager is called a template. Both Deployment Manager and Azure Resource Manager allow you to define resources to create in the instance, and both enable you to define arbitrary name-value pairs and technology-specific metadata key-value pairs. In Azure Resource Manager templates, you can specify user data scripts to run when launching Azure VM instances. In Deployment Manager configurations, you can define a metadata key called startup script with inline commands or a script file to run when the VM launches. In both Azure Resource Manager and Deployment Manager, you can specify that a resource depends on the creation of one or more other resources. In Azure Resource Manager templates, you can use predefined pseudoparameters such as Azure location, or define your own parameters to make your template flexible. In Deployment Manager, template properties can be passed in as parameters to templates. Environment variables are the equivalent to pseudoparameters.